And nervous New Yorkers are all waiting on Governor Andrew Cuomo, who must decide whether to uphold the statewide moratorium on hydrofracking. Earlier this week, New York's highest court ruled that local townships and cities had the right to prohibit drilling within their boundaries. But it's up to the governor to decide on giving that discretion to them. New York Governor Andrew Cuomo inherited a fracking ban from his predecessor, David Paterson, when taking office in 2011. The moratorium bans fracking, which is a controversial way of accessing natural gas and shale rock by pumping water, sand, and other chemicals into wells at very high pressures. There has been some pushback over the environmental effects of fracking, including recent reports connecting the procedure to earthquakes in Oklahoma. Opponents to fracking in New York State fear that if Cuomo lifts this statewide ban, the decision to frack would fall to local municipalities, creating a potential patchwork of towns that would allow this process. This will no doubt be a very difficult decision for Cuomo, as energy industry proponents say they will bring many jobs and companies to the state. Now, I was joined earlier by Deborah Goldberg, attorney at earthjustice.org. She successfully argued on behalf of the New York town of Dryden when they were being sued by Norse Energy, a petrol and nat gas company. I first asked her about Governor Cuomo's stance on fracking.
I don't really know how Governor Cuomo will decide, but I certainly hope he will not terminate the environmental review process right now. We are nowhere near to the point where we understand fully what the health impacts of this industry are going to be. And one would certainly hope that he would wait until the evidence is in on that front, which is just beginning to come in on peer-reviewed studies, before he makes any decision with respect to oil and gas development in New York State.
And now, obviously, you prevailed in your case defending the Dryden's opposition to fracking against Norse. What was your argument? How did you get the win?
Well, there's a long-standing tradition in New York of local control over zoning. It's been recognized in our Constitution. It's been recognized by the courts. And all the towns were trying to do was to use that power to define how land is going to be used within their borders. They had never allowed any kind of heavy industry, and the oil and gas industry was trying to tell them that they were entitled to a special treatment, special exemption from that. The court didn't buy it. The court said that state law, which does regulate the technical operations, does not reach to the land use authority, and the towns still have that longstanding power to regulate land use.
Now, as you just mentioned, the research behind the effects of fracking still remain pretty limited. How hard was it to argue that fracking is bad for health and bad for the environment against sometimes very obvious economic data that says that it'll bring in money to the economy?
Well, that isn't really an issue for the case. The case is not decided on policy grounds. It's really a very strict legal question about whether state law trumps the local law. And what the court found was that the two different legal regimes could work together harmoniously. The state could regulate the technical operations and activities and processes of the industry, and the localities could regulate the land use. And therefore, they had the power to protect themselves from what those impacts might be by keeping the oil and gas wells outside their borders.
And now, if all of these smaller communities have fracking bans, but the statewide moratorium is dropped by the governor, what would fracking look like across New York? And does Earth Justice still look at this as a small win?
Well, we think this is a big win. We think it's huge that the communities will have the right to use their zoning powers to keep heavy industry out of their borders. These are towns that have sustainable businesses like wineries or tourism industries, agriculture, and they do not want a huge industrialization in their area. It's possible that the industry will try to move into towns that have not adopted these provisions. But as the information comes in from other states, from Colorado, from Pennsylvania, from Wyoming, where there's very intensive gas development, everything we hear just gets worse and worse. And so now that the towns know they have this option, there might be some additional activity there. They know they no longer have a threat of litigation because the Court of Appeals has given them the right to go forward with these local measures.
So, well, if these cities and towns can prohibit drilling within their own boundaries, how will this play out in these local communities? Could, say, one farmer say yes to the drilling and the other farmer, his neighbor, says no?
Well, not if they're in the same town. I mean, the town will decide what, excuse me, what the land use regulation is for the whole town. It's possible that there could be one town that excludes heavy industry from within its borders and another town that doesn't. And in that case, there could be wells in the town that doesn't exclude the industry. There could be impacts that go over the borders. After all, air emissions, pollution doesn't respect municipal boundaries. And there could be recourse by people who are affected by the adverse impacts caused across borders, but they would not be land use controls. Those would be different sorts of legal protections.
So just so we're clear, if say one town did allow for fracking to come into their town, and let's say, as far as private ownership goes, one neighbor against the next, if in that town they're allowed to drill, would it boil down to neighbor versus neighbor? Could it be something like that?
Well, that's how it is in many parts of the country right now. There are places where it's permitted and people don't want to lease their land, and it does pit neighbor against neighbor. It pits family, members of families against each other. People have different values. Some people really care about the long-term sustainable use of their land, and some people want to make a quick buck and get out. And different people have different choices to make, but it's definitely tearing many communities apart because people care about different things.
Right. Well, tell us about the power that these industries have within the state and within the U.S. as a whole. Do they have a lot of weight to throw around in New York City, or New York rather?
Well, they have a huge amount of power and enormous wealth. I mean, they've managed to essentially buy exemptions from every major federal environmental law that otherwise would govern heavy industrial activity. They also are extremely active within state legislatures. And in many states, the state representatives simply will not step up to the plate because they're very much in the pocket of the industry. That's why these local measures are so important. There's this huge gap, vacuum, for protecting local communities. And if local people don't step up, there's often very little protection from higher levels of government.
Great. Thank you so much for your insight. That was Deborah Goldberg, attorney at earthjustice.org. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.